Dutch rule made a big difference. There was domestic social change, which we'll talk about in a moment. There was the international Islamic revival movement, which had a great impact here. And finally, there was population growth. It's very hard to measure the impact of population growth. But in 1800, the population of the island of Java was probably around about 3 million, something like that. By the end of the century, it was 25 million. So it went up something like 8 times in the course of the 19th century. And of course, that meant that the population expanded into areas where it had not lived before. There was a lot of pressure on land, and so on. Now, looking at social change first. We talk about the Dutch cultuurstelsel, the system tanam paksa, as a kind of state-run slavery of the whole society. And if you were an ordinary villager, there was much that was like that. But there was also a creation of an indigenous middle class, because there were a lot of economic activities that were not controlled by the state. So that, for example, bricklaying, entertainment, transport, shipping, fishing, lots of activities, even some sugar growing, a lot of things were not controlled by the state. So that allowed Javanese entrepreneurs to grow their wealth. It was also the case these entrepreneurs often had connections with trading communities in Javanese towns, and especially on the Pasisir Utara, that meant Arab communities. So the links between the Javanese middle class and Arab trading communities in the north coast became stronger. Now those Arab communities were a channel for the Islamic reform movements of the 19th century, but also the wealth, probably more importantly, the wealth of the new middle class enabled them to go in very large numbers on the Hajj. And the number, the jumlah orang yang naik Hajj, really was extraordinary. In 1850, according to Dutch records, the number of people who left Javanese-speaking areas to go on the Hajj to Mecca was 48. 48 people. Itu saja. Now, many people went via Singapore or they went via Aceh. They weren't known to the Dutch, but, jumlah kecil sekali. 8 years later, 1858, not 48 people, tapi lebih dari 2,000. More than 2,000 were now going on the Hajj. By 1898, hampir 5,000, siap tahun. 1921, 15,000 lebih. So this sudden explosion in the number of people going on the Hajj meant that more and more of the Javanese middle class were open to contacts with the Middle East reform movements. And we see two kinds of things. We see Sharia-oriented purification movements, but also we see Sufi-oriented purification movements. Especially the Naqshbandiya and the Qadiriya wa Naqshbandiya became very important, more important than the Tariqat Shaqariya. Now, that's the reform movement, but some people resisted it, didn't care for it. The great modernizer and poet of Java, Mangkunegoro IV, probably his most famous poem is the Weda Tomo. And in one passage in the Weda Tomo, he says this: many are the young people who boast of their theological knowledge, although they're not qualified. They're in a hurry to show off. The way they interpret Arabic texts is like a Said from Egypt. Each time they belittle others. Such persons are frauds. They deny their Javanese-ness and bend their steps to Mecca in search of knowledge. So the idea there's something wrong with this. There's something wrong with this kind of purification movement. These Islamic reformers set up schools. Schools are very important. The number of pasantrans, again, exploded in the 19th century. And the number of santri, the number of students at pasantrans went up dramatically. Now, many of those pasantrans are, of course, only taught to read the Quran, not the Quran. But many of them were also places for reformism. So that's one form of resistance. The second form of resistance to reform movements was the emergence of a new group of people, for the first time in history, who were called abangan. Now, before the 19th century, there is no trace of a group called abangan in Javanese sources or in Dutch sources about Java. Jadi pertama kali kalangan abangan itu muncul pada pertengahan abad ke-19. And that term abangan was a sort of term, an insulting term, semacam penghinaan. It was used by the pious to describe their ignorant neighbors. Now, the evidence is limited, but it does seem that one of the characteristics of the abangan was that they ceased, mereka berhenti bersembahyang. They stopped paying zakat, they stopped praying. So the society which the five pillars of the faith were observed becomes a society